Chapter 8. The sun was setting and the temperature had dropped. They approached a tree that had fallen across the trail. He climbed on the trunk and offered her his hand. Maggie braced a foot and hoisted herself up. Cam jumped down the other side and took Maggie with him. They walked deeper into the woods, following a well-worn path. Cam often took advantage of this spot, like many other hikers. With any luck, it would be empty of any squatters. They came upon a clearing where the tall grass had been packed flat. Rocks enclosed a circular patch of scorched ground. "You shouldn't make a fire," he said. "Try to leave nature the way you found it, as undisturbed as possible." Maggie slid her backpack off.
"Somebody's obviously made a fire here."
"Yep. So if we make a fire, we won't be disturbing nature." He untied the casing to his gray tent and shrugged it off. "Not as much as we would if a fire hadn't already burned here." He finished pitching his tent and reached for her backpack.
"Could I sleep in your tent? I hate sleeping alone."
When Cam tore the pack from her, Maggie dropped to the ground and crossed her legs. As he anchored the last stake, he asked, "Want some popcorn for the show?" Maggie shrugged. Cam headed toward the woods. He returned shortly, carrying a stack of large branches. He made a fire, and they sat on the ground and watched the flames dance. Maggie tried to spark conversation, but he never spoke a word, just poked at the fire until darkness surrounded them.
"Good night."
She stood and looked down at him, probably waiting for him to protest her departure. Not going to happen.
"Whatever," she muttered.
When the second whiz of a zipper sounded, the tension in Cam's muscles faded. He just had to get through this weekend, then he could concentrate on opening his restaurant. He'd never have to see or speak to her again. One problem. He wanted her. Wanted her bad. Maggie was bold, adventurous, and silly, not to mention stunning. She was cute and at the same time, sexy as hell. Her fair skin clashed brilliantly with her cherry red hair and green eyes. And her perfume. He had to find out the brand. Like an addict, he could use it to diminish the cravings, spraying his curtains, sofa, and bedding. Cam squeezed his head between his hands. "You're a monster. Let her go." An animal shrieked. Cam's lids flipped open. He lifted his head from the tent floor and propped his weight on his forearms. An owl? Another shriek. Nope, not an owl. He jerked to a sitting position. Maggie! The three-quarter moon illuminated Maggie's shaking tent. He whipped her flap open to find her jumping up and down and slapping at her arms. Grimacing, he snatched her wrist and yanked her from the tent. "Calm down."
"They're biting me. They're everywhere."
Cam willed his temper to cool as he tried to still her movements. "I can't get them off if you don't stop jumping." He slapped at the ants crawling up his arms. "Take off your clothes." Maggie struggled with the bottom of her princess shirt. Cam swatted her hands away, yanked her shirt over her head, and tugged her shorts down her legs. Maggie stood in her fire engine red undies and matching lace bra. He swiped his hands down her arms and legs, turned her, and did the same down her back, stopping periodically to wipe the little fuckers from his own limbs. She bounced on one foot and clawed at the other. "I can't help you if you don't stop jumping around like a kindergartner at recess." Maggie put her foot down, raised her other, and gave it the same clawing treatment.
"Why are my feet so itchy?"
"It's your body reacting to the venom." Cam framed her face with his hands. "Your lips are swollen. Are you allergic to ant venom?"
"I don't think so."
He dragged her toward his tent, but she jerked from his grasp.
"What if they're in your tent too?"
"Unlike you, I'm not dumb enough to leave food in my tent."
"I did not leave food in my tent."
He gave her a sidelong look.
Maybe a little bit of that energy bar.
If it'll make you feel better, I'll move my tent away from yours, okay?
They have legs.
Would you go to a restaurant you knew had no food? Cam yanked the tent stakes up and dragged his tent away from hers, then escorted her around the tent. Using a flashlight, he showed her there were no ants and ushered her inside and did the same inspection. Maggie looked barely convinced, but conceded, since her only other option was to stand under the moonlight in nothing but bra and panties. She sat in the center of the tent and clawed at her feet. Cam threw her one of his t-shirts and retrieved an EpiPen from his backpack. He waited for her to put on his shirt, then crooked his finger. She gestured to the item in his hand.
What's that?
EpiPen. I always have one with me. I'm allergic to bees. Maggie scurried to the corner.
I don't do needles.
Smiling, he crawled toward her. Not my problem.
I'll kill you if you put that thing in me.
He cocked his head and gave her a sultry smile. Isn't that what you wanted from the start? Me to stick it in you? Her brows furrowed.
Now you flirt?
Seizing both her wrists in one hand, he jerked her close. She wiggled and kicked, but he handled her as if she were an inanimate object.
I hate you!
With an arm barred across her chest, he raised the needle over her thigh. Can't have you dying on me. I'm too lazy to carry your dead weight the rest of the way.
That's so sweet.
She looked so damn sexy when she was mad. Are you ready? He delayed intentionally, loving every minute of her torture.
Wait, my feet aren't itchy anymore. They feel much better. Yes, I'm good.
Cam's smile widened. She reached, but he lifted his arm.
What if you get stung by a bee?
Unlike you, my reaction would be severe. This wouldn't help me. I'd be dead in minutes.
Then why do you carry it?
If I'm not in the middle of the woods, miles from civilization, it'd give me time to get to the hospital.
I don't need it.
Maggie shook her head.
I don't want it.
Sorry, babe. He drilled the needle into her thigh.
Bastard.
It's your own damn fault. Cam tossed the empty canister at his backpack, sat on his butt, and draped his forearms over his slightly bent knees. Maggie hugged her knees into her chest.
There's only one sleeping bag.
Yep. She had no recognition of her surroundings. It's October in Texas. It's close to 80 degrees, if not warmer. I don't need a sleeping bag. You take it. He laid down facing away from her, using a bent arm for a pillow.
I can still feel them biting me.
It's your imagination. Go to sleep. Cam sensed she made a face at his back. She was entertaining, if nothing else. Sleeping in the tent with Maggie wasn't an option, so the plan was to wait for her to fall asleep, then leave, make a fire, and wait for dawn. Cam could just tell her the truth and leave the tent now, but he was ashamed of his problem. If possible, he'd keep his violent sleeping seizures his little secret. Then he fell asleep. Cam rolled to his stomach, punched, kicked, and screamed. You drunk fuck. Maggie scurried from her sleeping bag and crawled to the corner.
Wake up!
He scrambled to his hands and knees and stared at her. His chest rose and lowered with dramatic form. Heavy breaths hissed through his clenched teeth. Sweat saturated his hair and clothes. His black, messed hair only added to his rugged handsomeness.
Are you okay?
He leapt at her. Maggie jumped back, but he snatched her wrist and dragged her under him. Saliva dripped from his snarling lips. Her eyes widened. Instinct told her not to struggle. Surely he'd wake at any moment. But as the sound of his labored breath reverberated throughout the small tent, she began seriously doubting her decision to come on this trip. What the hell was she thinking? Cam lowered his head. Maggie winced and held her breath. This man was crazed, not the man who confiscated her hairspray just hours ago. The weight of his large frame collapsed over her trembling body. He covered her mouth with his, drowning her screams. The strength of the kiss pinned her head to the tent floor. His tongue forced its way inside her mouth, exploring with a primitive desperation. The feel of his weight on hers. His coarse palms on her face. The scent of the salt in his sweat drew a guttural groan from her. If Maggie's head wasn't spinning from the scent of his minty breath, she probably would have questioned why he changed his mind about her. Maybe later. Right now, she planned to devour every inch of his massive, muscular body. Cam's fingers walked down her thigh and slid under her shirt. "You feel so good." He pushed her shirt above her breasts and covered her hard nipple with his mouth. He licked and sucked while a hand slipped down her panties. Sliding 2 fingers inside her, he stroked, his fingers plunging and withdrawing at a tortuous and slow pace. "You're so fucking wet." She arched her back and tilted her hips, urging his rocking fingers to sink deeper, move faster. His head jerked back. He tugged her shirt to her waist. "Maggie?"
"What's wrong?"
Cam dashed from the tent. Maggie jumped to her feet, whipping the tent flap open. She followed. Pacing, his hands covering his face, he growled, "Don't ever wake me from a nightmare."
"It didn't feel like a nightmare."
With his head down, he sprinted and vanished behind the shadows of the night. Maddening. She could kill him if she didn't want to fuck him so badly. When Jags told her that Cam was pent up from sexual frustration, she could hardly believe it. Cam was rather big and rough around the edges, which made him somewhat scary, but the man was hot as hell, and apparently practiced abstinence. When she assured Jags that Cam's vow of celibacy was on the brink of collapse, she did so with confidence, absolute certainty. But here she stood in the middle of the woods, dressed in a tee and panties, albeit wet panties, as sexually frustrated as Cam. Maggie crawled back into the tent. The plan was to stay awake until he returned. Then she fell asleep.